Hello, welcome to Leftist Labor History. My name is Nate and I'm your host. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the Gilded Age. This is a time of extreme inequality, as suggested by how, I'm referring to it. This is the period immediately after Reconstruction that is marked by rapid societal, economic, labor change, and as well as a lot of unrest. So there is a lot to talk about, and let's get into it. What's happening is industrial capitalism is on the rise, and this is happening with northern industries and northern money in the American North. So where does this money come from? Well, a lot of it comes from the products of slavery, plantation slavery. I didn't talk about the Middle Passage much in the slavery episode, but the Middle Passage was when slavers would abduct people from the west coast of Africa, bring them to the Americas. So the Middle Passage was incredibly deadly. During the whole course of it, between 1 and 2 million enslaved people died from disease or suicide, or they were maimed or killed by the slave ship crew. Some slave ships used a scheme called tight packing, which is where they would put more people on the boat than they had supplies for. So they would count on a certain number of people dying on the journey across the Atlantic Ocean because that's how deadly it was. Running a slave ship expedition is very capital intensive, right? So you have to have a ship, you have to have a crew. And so companies started to spring up in order to finance these slave ships. And then when you're dealing with that amount of money, you want to have insurance. And so insurance companies began to underwrite these slave voyages. A lot of these firms were and are based in New York. So Wall Street is named after a wall, a physical wall that was nearby. That wall was built by enslaved African Americans, and a couple of blocks away from the New York Stock Exchange, people discovered that there was a mass grave, an unmarked mass grave of African Americans, enslaved people. So Wall Street is very nearly built directly on a mass grave of enslaved people. And figuratively speaking, a lot of finance, at least in the United States, so there were financial firms in London that were also underwriting the slave trade, but a lot of financial firms and insurance firms, some of the major banks and insurance companies that are still around today began during this era. In addition to finance, so for example, textile mills in New England would buy cotton from plantations in the South and turn that into cloth. But a lot of these people, a lot of this industry that supported quote unquote free labor, they built their fortunes basically on plantation slavery. But what we start to see during the Gilded Age is a kind of shift in the paradigm that's going to happen very rapidly. Okay, so we're going to start in 1869 for a few reasons. One is that 1869 was when the so-called Golden Spike was driven to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, joining the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad. We're going to talk about railroads. So railroads are emblematic of the kind of industry that is on the rise during this period. It made a few people phenomenally wealthy, and it killed a lot of people, and it didn't really do much good for anybody. I'm going to get into that. Another reason I want to start in 1869 is that was the beginning of the Knights of Labor. So we're finally going to talk about a labor union. I'm fudging a little bit, but in 1868, the publication of the book edition of Ragged Dick by Horatio Alger. And this is going to be the first of just a slew of rags to riches novels that Horatio Alger is going to publish. And these are wildly popular. He's going to sell millions and millions of copies of these stories. They're very formulaic. They're all about, a little street urchin, and he works hard and pulls himself up by the bootstraps. And this is something, so I mentioned that because I'm going to get into kind of the conditions of the age and the reactions that people had to it. One reaction is just this wild hope that they too, if I work hard and apply myself, I'm gonna hit my big break and I'm gonna become, extremely wealthy, right? So we've got, labor organizing, and these aren't nets. I'm kind of setting these up as alternatives, but these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? But you've got this kind of materialist, like I'm gonna join a labor union, or you got this like fanciful thinking of I'm gonna be the next rags to riches. I'm gonna be the next, Joseph Carnegie. So that's kind of why I'm starting where I am. I want to emphasize that these things are happening rapidly. So the Gilded Age was coined by Mark Twain in a novel that was published in 1873. So this gets right underway. 8 years after the end of the Civil War, it's, that's pretty rapid change. One thing that's happening during this period is the mode of employment for the majority of people is going to shift. Between 1870 and 1910, so in 40 years' time, two generations' time, the percentage of self-employed people in the United States went from 67% to 37%. So you have about 2/3 of working people who are self-employed in 1870, and by 1910, it's almost down to about 1/3. And this is going to continue to decrease as wage labor takes hold, and that's really significant. I think that is something that is worth emphasizing, right? Now, there's a couple ways that we explain that, though, too. One is that you've got an agrarian economy that is transitioning to an industrial economy. So as methods of farming become more efficient, there simply aren't as many farmers needed, and there's jobs in the city that are pulling people toward these urban centers. But something else that is going on is a huge influx of immigrants. So immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, as well as from Asia, are just pouring into the United States during this period. So 27.5 million immigrants came to the United States between 1865 and 1918. So the whole Ellis Island Statue of Liberty mythos was formed during this time, right? The Statue of Liberty, give me your poor, you're tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free or whatever. So that's one factor that is really going to contribute to this shift towards wage labor. Okay, so we're still talking about, I still want to kind of give you context for what work looks like during the Gilded Age. Okay, so this era is also known as the technological revolution. And that's because railroads, or railroad track is being built, that this is a new technology for transportation. Telegrams are going to start popping up, and people are going to be instantly be able to communicate with across huge distances. Very significant stuff. And industry is developing new technologies. So something I want to point out is that these technologies are very selectively being deployed. And in fact, really what's happening is if there's a technology that can make a robber baron rich, that's going to be deployed. If it's going to keep a lowly Chinese laborer on the railroad safe, that technology is not going to be deployed, right? So on the one hand, you have this kind of glorified version of this era where it's like, oh my God, all these technological changes, isn't this so wonderful? This is revolutionizing. This is changing how we think about time and space, and that's the kind of sales pitch. But at the same time, to give you an example, so the railroads during this time, on a train, you have multiple railroad cars, and you join them together, and that's called coupling. And the technology was developed so that automatic coupling, which is now commonplace, automatic coupling was developed during this time period. But railroad companies were not too bothered about implementing. It was costly to install automatic couplers on these railroad trains when you can just have a guy do it, right? So a lot of the coupling of these railroad train cars, which are often moving as you're coupling them, you got a guy out there. People are losing limbs. People are being pulled under the train and dying. This is a very dangerous job. But hey, who cares, right? We can save money if we don't upgrade to automatic couplers. Technology during this period is not being used to benefit humanity. It's being used to control labor. Steel production is developing all of these new technologies which remove the skill from people's positions, because if you de-skill a job, then you can just get any guy off the street to come in and pour the slag off your steel or whatever it is that you're trying to do. You don't have to go to a skilled worker, and you don't have to pay skilled workers wages. There's no such thing as unskilled labor, but there was a big emphasis during this time on de-skilling labor so that workers become cogs in this factory system. In the 1880s and 1890s, a man named Frederick Taylor is going to develop this system called scientific management. And this is the assembly line, right? This is the proto Henry Ford. Anybody can get hired, and with minimal training, they can do their one little task and pass the project on to the next guy, and he builds the next little step in the widget. And this is called Taylorism, after Frederick Taylor. The point of this is to de-skill these positions in order to pay lower wages, and in order to make it so the company isn't beholden, to whatever small degree they were before, to skilled artisans. Let's pause there. Let's bracket that. I want to talk a little theory at you. So Karl Marx and Capital, which on our timeline. So Capital, which was published in German in 1867. We're not going to get an English translation until 1887. But Marx has this insight, which I think is very applicable. So, when we talk about a labor market under capitalism, there's this idea that there's supply and demand, and hey, if there aren't as many workers, then demand for these jobs is going to go up, and wages will go up, like as with any other market. And Marx says that's not the case, right? Capitalists control who is in the labor market. Okay, so Marx writes, the whole form of the movement of modern industry depends upon the constant transformation of a part of the laboring population into unemployed or half-employed hands. One way that this takes place is by bringing women and children into the labor force. If you want to continue to force wages down, you start giving jobs to women and children. And giving jobs to women is not bad, but child labor is universally frowned upon because children shouldn't risk their lives at work and should actually be learning and developing as human people. De-skilling is another. So what I just talked about, de-skilling is another way to control the amount of the population that is employed. Other quotes: taking them as a whole, the general movements of wages are exclusively regulated by the expansion and contraction of the industrial reserve army. Relative surplus population is therefore the pivot upon which the law of demand and supply of labor works. Right? So basically, the point is we don't have a fixed labor pool. So these laws of supply and demand where wages would rise on their own, this is not what happens. And we're going to see that in the 20th century when we get to it. Wages are not just going to rise on their own. So Marx is spot on here. But the capitalist class has an ace up its sleeve at the same time. So if workers are able to gain some measure of control over, these laws of supply and demand, Marx says, then the capitalist class rebels against the sacred law of supply and demand and tries to check its inconvenient action by forcible means and state interference. So basically, when you start seeing labor unions go on strike, then that's when you call in the National Guard. That's when you call in the Pinkertons to come bust some heads. I'm going to talk more about that in another episode, in the next episode. But basically, this is what we're seeing during this time period is de-skilling. Women and children are being pulled into the labor force. Something else that's going on is immigration. So industrial capitalists have this huge new pool of labor to draw upon. A lot of these people, so this is like the melting pot idea. People are showing up from Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Finland and Italy, and people don't speak the language. If you're going to make money off these people's labor, you kind of have to have them put into positions where you don't have to really spend a lot of time developing their skills and their traits. And so what's happening is industrialists are just making, horrid amounts of money, while these immigrants are oftentimes living in, slum conditions. This is the context of what's happening. And so I mentioned, right, you've got the Horatio Alger fantasy. You just want to mention, so I want to go back. I think this is a really powerful idea. I think it's important to have a measure of respect for this idea. It's a fantasy, right? But this really happens for like Joseph Carnegie, right? He works his way to the top and becomes a captain of industry. This immigrant from Scotland. But the shape of the whole system is that you're going to pour an army of people into poverty and, dangerous conditions and disease and, You're going to have people, dynamiting themselves trying to build this transcontinental railroad. And 1 out of 1 million is going to become a self-made man. Not to mention that this is all occurring on stolen land. This is all, being financed with capital that was made from chattel slavery. So on the one hand, this is delusional, right? This is completely this is at odds with reality. But if you're that one person, and this goes back, so if we go back to 1600s British North America, if you're that one guy, you start on the streets of London when you're 14 or whatever, and you get shipped off to Virginia, you manage to survive, you manage to finish your indenture, and then you get your own little piece of land, you're feeling like a king, right? This is a very powerful idea for you. You made it against the odds. Frankly, this takes on religious significance. Max Weber identified what he called the Protestant work ethic. The Protestant work ethic is the idea that God favors some people. And the way that you find out if you're one of God's, chosen is to work really hard. And if you succeed, ta-da, you're God's favorite person, right? Horatio Alger was briefly a minister before he sexually assaulted 2 teenage boys. Right, so this is a religious idea. This is a religious idea. And on the other hand, you have more pragmatic, materialist means of trying to improve your life, which is labor unions. The Knights of Labor during the 1870s is going to become something new. And again, this is kind of a homegrown American thing. This is not, all that influenced by, Marx per se. It's influenced by people saying, hey, we want an 8-hour workday. We want fair pay. We want to end child labor. And so during the 1870s, the Knights of Labor stops being a secret society, and it becomes a labor union which organizes everybody in a workplace. So this is a shift from craft guilds and trade unions where you have an association of tailors, or you have an association of steel workers or whatever, and the trade union tradition is going to continue on, but the Knights of Labor are really the first ones, at least in the U.S., who say we're going to organize everybody. We're going to organize women. We're going to organize Black people and immigrants. So in 1877, there is a railroad. It's called the Great Railroad Strike. There's such overwhelming participation in this strike. My understanding of it, based on what I know, is that there was kind of groundswell of all these workers that are just pissed off and angry, and this is their outlet. And a lot of them end up joining the Knights of Labor. And so by 1886, at its peak, it has 700,000 members. So that's huge for the time, right? So it's this big, huge force to be reckoned with. I want to talk about the ugly side of this, right? Okay, so on the one hand, this is, a triumph for organized labor. Especially the kind of the openness to, organizing everybody. But the ugly side of this is the Knights of Labor. So in the mid 1800s, a lot of people immigrated from China into the west coast of the United States. A lot of Chinese labor ended up working on the railroads, and in fact, Chinese immigrants were the dominant workforce. Approximately 9 in 10 workers on the railroad, building the railroads, were Chinese. And the remainder were mostly Irish. So you have an immigrant workforce building the railroads. Chinese people, not many Chinese people spoke English, and it was common for Chinese people to sign 5-year contracts to build these railroads. Right, this is extremely dangerous work. You have people with minimal training, no safety training, and you're putting them out there to move tons and tons of rock with dynamite or machinery or whatever it is, or by hand or whatever. You've got people getting maimed and killed on a regular basis, and in the instances when Chinese workers protested and did direct action, in one case the railroad owners just starved them. They just said, okay, well, we're not going to feed you until you go back to work. This is the amount of control that employers had over this immigrant workforce that is building this great wonder of the United States, and this harbinger of manifest destiny, which is the Transcontinental Railroad. So these are the people doing the hard work at tremendous cost of life and limb. And the people who are benefiting are the money people. So Jay Gould, Leland Stanford, these people are making their names off of these railroads in a couple of different ways, right? So through the exploitation of labor, but also I mentioned the Homestead Act. So the first Homestead Act was passed in 1862, and a lot of people were able to, get some land for next to nothing. It's not for the point of land speculation, but wealthy people had friends in Congress, for one, and the law was vague. And most of that land actually went to wealthy investors. And railroad interests particularly capitalized off of this land, because if you're going to lay track, you got to have the right of way. And then, because the railroad was a road to nowhere, the railroad titans got their money by convincing people that west, you want to be out west, it's so great out there. This was propaganda meant to make it so these land speculators didn't lose their money. The idea was that if you go and plow up farmland, then that's going to cause a change in the climate. That's going to cause more rain, and then magically you're going to be able to farm without irrigation in South Dakota. And this doesn't happen. So a lot of these people are making money off of the Western invasion of Native American lands. And this involves the federal army coming in and fighting battles with Plains Indians and removing them and slaughtering them. They're making money off of exploiting the Homestead Act. They're making money off of exploiting immigrant labor. And they're making money off of lying to people and selling this idealized version of the American West. That was a bit of a tangent, but basically this is what's happening during the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. The white people who are organizing as the Knights of Labor, even though the ideals are that, hey, we'll organize with immigrants, anti-Chinese prejudice really grows, and they begin to lobby to end Chinese immigration. So partly because of the lobbying of the Knights of Labor, the United States passes the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which ends all immigration from China. As part of this anti-Chinese sentiment, there are, violent pogroms committed against Chinese people, and, particularly in the American West. So in 1885, there's a called the Rock Springs Massacre, where white workers killed at least 28 Chinese people. As a result of this Chinese sentiment, the people who had already immigrated from China and remained in the United States, so people wouldn't hire them and this was in coordination with the labor unions, people wouldn't hire them for any jobs except for service jobs, such as laundry or cooking. I want to go back to this notion of Marx's Industrial Reserve Army. So in this case, the Knights of Labor, by supporting Chinese exclusion and by whipping up this anti-Chinese prejudice, they are doing capital's job for them. On the one hand, yes, they are, engaged in all of these great direct actions that are challenging the power of capital. On the other hand, they're helping capital to regulate the Industrial Reserve Army. They're helping capital to regulate this supply and demand of the labor pool so that wages stay low for everybody. This is a mistake. I mean, this is not only wrong and violent, this is a tactical mistake for the Knights of Labor to support Chinese exclusion. And the way I'm thinking about this is, right, so there are laws, but there's also cultural norms. There's also cultural, socio-political ideas about what is legitimate work and who is doing legitimate work. And capitalists can manipulate that. Capitalists can manipulate racism. They can manipulate xenophobia to make it so that you have this pool of full-time workers. And on the margins, you have half-employed or unemployed people. And at any point, if you need to tap into that pool of labor, you can. If people are agitating for higher wages, you say, oh, well, look, now I'm going to scoop these people into your job. And what racism does is it turns all the anger that should go towards the capitalist class towards other workers. So this is a huge mistake. Workers are going to continue to make the mistake for at least the next century. And it's never going to turn out. And the reason why is because when you do this kind of stuff, you're doing the capitalist class's job for them. Anyway, so now we come up to 1886, and this is as good a point as any to kind of, we're going to end our history of this episode here at 1886. So what this is this is the high point of membership in the Knights of Labor. Again, 700,000 workers. And what's going to happen is the Haymarket Affair. And this represents a turning point where capitalists and the state, with the help of law enforcement, they're going to decide, okay, you have gotten away with enough. We're gonna put the hammer down. All right, so the Haymarket Affair. So as part of a protest for an 8-hour workday, workers gathered, and police ended up killing one of the strikers and injuring several others. And workers gathered the next day in Haymarket Square, and somebody detonated a bomb, killed several people, several policemen. Police started just firing into the crowd. As a result, the state convicted 8 people. And this was part of the state wanted to send a message. This anti-labor sentiment, anti-anarchist sentiment is starting to take hold. And they sentenced 8 people to death. Some of these people were not even at the incident, but they were convicted of helping to plan this bombing. And 4 people are hanged. One person kills himself, and the other 3 are sentenced to life in prison. So their death sentence is commuted to life in prison. This is seen as the time when the capitalist class, right? So if we're talking about the Industrial Reserve Army, they're using these different levers. They're using these levers to control the surplus population and the working population, and labor starts to get a foothold, and they start to be able to call the shots. And then so the capitalist class, as Marx predicted, they start to use the state and they start to use violence to put a check on these labor actions. And the result does, in fact, have a chilling effect on Knights of Labor membership. So next time, we're going to pick it up from there. We're going to talk about the labor organizing that happens around the turn of the century. We're going to talk about the labor repression that happens as in an attempt to stop or at least hinder this rampant union organizing. And that's going to set us up for the New Deal. And then we're going to talk about that, 2 episodes from now. Anyway, thanks for joining. Shout out to my dog, Lou. Should we get a shot of Lou? There's Lou. All right. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope you come back for the next episode. Okay, bye.